to share with you a lesson, and as we go through it, what I want you to do is really to wear two hats. I want you to wear your teacher hat, and I want you to think about what would I have to do as a teacher to make this approach work with my students? What kind of adaptations would I have to make? What kind of choices would I have to make in terms of my curriculum? And then your second hat, I want you to wear a student hat and think about how your students would react to the material and the approach if you used it with them in the classroom. So you're kind of going to go through this a little bit bipolar in this section. The lesson that I'm going to share with you starts off with this question. I ask my students, and I'll ask you the same question, what's the difference between the truth, a lie, a half-truth, an exaggeration, or today's SAT word, obfuscation? What's the difference?
I said that the difference would be dependent upon who's telling the story, the background of and the information given by who tells it.
Okay, and that's key. The difference is your intent. How many people in here have intended to tell the truth at least one point in time in their life? How many of you have intended to tell a lie? Those of you without your hands up are currently doing it. How many of you, and every man should have his hand up, have exaggerated at one point in time? There we go. How many of you have told a half-truth? All right. We make choices. When we say things or do things, we make a conscious choice about how we want to deliver that information. Sometimes you want to tell the truth. Sometimes you want to lie. And the distinction becomes important in this lesson around the country of Colombia. Outlined in red is the country of Colombia as it existed at the turn of the 20th century. The majority of Colombia is on the South American continent, but a portion of it cut up into the Central American Isthmus. And so Colombia is the sort of area of interest, but in particular, England, France, and the United States are looking for a place to build a canal that will connect the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. The English bow out, and the French actually make the first effort. And the guy on the right, Philippe Jean Buenaventura, was a French engineer who was heavily invested in the French effort to build a canal to connect Atlantic and Pacific. The problem for Philippe and the French is that they failed, and they lost millions of dollars. And so Philippe Jean Buenaventura, wanting to recover some of his money, begins to target the United States. The problem is the United States is interested in building the canal in Nicaragua, not in Colombia. And so Philippe Jean Buenaventura commissions the stamp that you see on the bottom right-hand side. And he has it issued from the country of Nicaragua, and on it is an exploding volcano. And he attaches it to a postcard that he sends to every member of the United States Congress. And that postcard essentially says, there are no volcanoes in Colombia. Don't build it in Nicaragua. And he convinces the United States Congress that the best place to build a canal is in this portion of the country of Colombia. And so the United States negotiates a treaty with Colombia to build the canal, and the Colombian Parliament rejects it in 1903. 1 year later, in the brand new country of Panama, the United States begins digging the Panama Canal. Between the rejection by the Colombian Parliament and the construction of the canal, there is a revolution in Colombia which gives birth to the country of Panama. And President Theodore Roosevelt reflected on this revolution in his autobiography in 1912. And so take a moment and see what he has to say about the events in Panama. So in a nutshell, what does Teddy have to say? We didn't do it. It happened, but nobody connected with the government prepared, incited, or was involved in the events. We simply stood back and allowed the events to occur. And so what I pose to my students, the question that drives this lab, is what is Teddy Roosevelt doing in his autobiography? Is he telling us the truth? Is he lying? Is he giving us a half-truth? Is he exaggerating? Or is he using today's SAT word, obfuscation? And what I want my students to do is to wade into this period of time and to take a look at the events related to the Panamanian Revolution in Colombia and begin to discern what's happening with Teddy Roosevelt. When we do that, my students get sources, and each of you should have an historical source now that I handed out for you. If you flip it over to the back for a second, you'll see a chart that's akin to this. When my students get historical sources, I ask them to tackle it the way Sam Weinberg's historians tackled it. The first thing I want them to do, and the first thing I want you to do, is to figure out who wrote it, what we know about that person, when they wrote it, and how that time period might impact what they say. And so to do that, if you flip your source back to the front again, what I always provide for my students, and what's essential in this approach, is that contextual and subtextual information. And so in the box above your source is where you'll find information about the context and subtext of your source. What I teach my students to do, and what you're all going to do just because you want to comply and make me happy, is to take your source and fold it right underneath that top box. Anybody want to guess why we fold it there? Oh, actually, it's the other way. When students see a box, they think, what's inside? Could be the answer. They think it's directions. And what do they do with directions? They skip them. So I make my students fold it, and we read the box first, because you can't read an historic source unless you know who wrote it and when they wrote it. So I'll ask you to take a couple of minutes, read the information in that box, and then fill in the first column on the chart. What do we know about your author? What do we know about the time period that the document was created? Now we get to the really challenging portion of today. Historians cannot base their interpretation on one document. You won't be in the industry very long. You have to be able to corroborate across sources and build an argument. So in a second, you're going to be headed to a group, and in that group will be one representative for each of the sources. So there'll be 6 of you in the group. One will have source A, one will have source B, etc., etc. What I'll ask you to do is to take some time, share your sources, talk about them, and begin to build your argument. You can't just say, I think because I feel. Where in the evidence can you find support for your argument about President Theodore Roosevelt's statement regarding the Panamanian Canal? It doesn't have to be unanimous, but a general consensus as to what you think Roosevelt is doing in his autobiography as it relates to the Panamanian Revolution. And then I want you as a group to pick the 3 sources that you think best build or substantiate your answer to that historic question. So as a group, come to a consensus. What is Roosevelt doing? And then star or highlight or underline the top 3 pieces of evidence that you think support that particular argument.
I had a political cartoon that was in the New York Times, and it was basically a muckraking article trying to get them to investigate the president. And it's really simple. It had Philippe Jean over here, and he's got his papers where he was selling the land to the United States, and Roosevelt's over here just kind of standing back and waiting. And basically they're just handing over, through what happened, handing over Colombia to the United States.
Well, mine was a letter from the President of Colombia, so obviously it challenged what Roosevelt had to say. Part of it sounds more like opinion. It seems dishonorable. Secretary of State Hay has astonished the world. But then he starts talking about U.S. violated international law. They recognized the independence of Panama only days after the revolution.
The letter was more or less about how Colombia didn't recognize the southern states in the American Civil War, so they didn't feel like that they should recognize the seceding states of Panama.
And I think it's interesting that the artist is unknown.
Yeah.
A lot of times people don't have difficulty
Well,
putting their name
And it's
around
signed,
something.
but
But I think you can look at the way he's looking at this, and he's the one that's holding the shovel. So to me, it's kind of saying, I'm the one who opened this.
He's
whole-
hiding it behind his back too.
yeah.
I'm the one who
So
opened
that's
up
the
this whole
blatant-
ordeal.
yeah.
But I'm hiding what I'm doing.
Oh.
You know, he talks about how he was going to help those Colombians that were in Panama that wanted to revolt, that we were going to help them. That if they had not revolted, then he would have recommended to Congress that they take possession of the isthmus by force.
This was written after the death of President Roosevelt, and he is basically, I'm source E, he is basically saying that he agrees with what President Roosevelt said, in that he didn't have it, that there was no part, and 20 years later there was no evidence saying that President Roosevelt did participate in. And then he says the dissemination of the truth about the Panama Revolution will also help to eliminate the pressure exercised on the conscience of people by the idea that Colombia was wronged.
That it kind of challenged it, but it also supported it. So I think it depends on how much students really read into it, and if they read into the subtext and kind of read between the lines. So.
Also depends if we're saying it challenges the truth, a lie, a half-truth, an obscure.
Very true,
Because if
yeah.
you said he's telling a half-truth, then maybe this sort of
Did it
supports
really
it because
mess
he
it up?
doesn't
Yeah.
really support Panama's revolution or, stage
Because he
it.
said nothing,
That's
yeah.
right. So I'm just sitting there doing nothing, and even three of his responses are that I distance myself from the governments that could be playing France and
Yeah.
Washington, D.C.